At my cousin's wedding, everyone clapped except my mother. She just stared at the groom's hands, and in that moment, I realized everything I thought I knew about my family was about to crumble. The ceremony was supposed to be perfect. Delilah had spent 2 years planning every detail, from the ivory roses to the hand-calligraphed invitations that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. She'd chosen the Rosewood Manor, this gorgeous estate with sprawling gardens and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the afternoon light just right. Everything was Pinterest perfect, exactly the kind of wedding that makes you believe in fairy tales again, even when you're 34 and divorced with a mortgage you can barely afford. I was sitting in the 3rd row, squeezed between my mother Elena and my uncle Marcus, watching my baby cousin transform into a bride. Delilah looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, the one that had been altered 3 times to fit perfectly. Her soon-to-be husband Sebastian stood at the altar looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine advertisement for expensive watches and weekend getaways. Dark hair perfectly styled, navy suit that probably cost more than my car payment, and this confident smile that suggested he'd never doubted anything in his entire life. The kind of man who orders wine without looking at the price and tips exactly 20%, because that's what successful people do. The ceremony flowed like water, smooth and predictable. Father Martinez spoke about love and commitment, while flower petals drifted from the arrangements overhead. Delilah's voice wavered just slightly during her vows, the way it always did when she was emotional, and Sebastian responded with this deep, steady tone that made all the aunts sigh quietly into their tissues. When they exchanged rings, his hands were steady and sure, manicured nails catching the light as he slipped the platinum band onto her finger. Those hands looked like they'd never done manual labor, never been dirty, never struggled with anything more challenging than deciding between the Tesla or the BMW. That's when I noticed my mother had gone completely still. Elena, who usually fidgeted through everything from church services to movies, who couldn't sit through a 10-minute phone call without organizing something, was frozen like a statue. Her hands were gripping her small pearl clutch so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and her face had this strange, distant expression I'd never seen before. She was staring at Sebastian's hands with the kind of intensity usually reserved for reading bad news or trying to solve impossible puzzles. When Father Martinez asked everyone to stand for the final blessing, my mother didn't move. I had to gently touch her shoulder, and even then, she rose slowly, like she was moving through thick water. The "you may kiss the bride" moment arrived with its predictable wave of applause and cheering. Rice flew through the air despite the venue's strict no-rice policy, and someone's camera flash went off every few seconds like tiny lightning strikes. Everyone was clapping and laughing and wiping away happy tears. The kind of celebration that makes you forget about mortgage payments and grocery bills and all the small disappointments that fill up regular days. Everyone except my mother. She stood there with her hands at her sides, not clapping, not smiling, just staring at Sebastian with this look that made my stomach tighten with worry. During the cocktail hour, while everyone mingled around tiny tables covered in white linens and discussed how beautiful everything looked, my mother disappeared. I found her 20 minutes later in the venue's small garden, sitting on a stone bench beside a fountain that bubbled quietly in the background. She was holding her phone, but not using it, just clutching it like an anchor while she stared at nothing in particular. The afternoon sun was filtering through the oak trees overhead, creating these dappled patterns of light and shadow across her dark blue dress, and for the first time in years, she looked small and fragile, in a way that scared me. "Mom, are you okay?" I asked, settling beside her on the bench. The stone was cool despite the warm day, and I could smell the jasmine growing along the garden walls. She didn't answer immediately, just continued staring at her phone screen, which I realized was blank. Did something happen? Are you feeling sick? Still nothing. It was like she'd gone somewhere else entirely, leaving just her body behind while her mind processed something too big or too terrible to share. Finally, she looked up at me with these eyes that seemed older than they had that morning. "Naomi," she said, and my name came out rough, like she'd forgotten how to use her voice. "I need to tell you something, but not here. Not today. After the reception." There was something in her tone that made me want to argue, to demand answers right there in the garden with the fountain bubbling and the wedding celebration continuing 50 yards away. But I could see in her face that pushing would only make her retreat further, so I nodded and helped her stand up. brushing a few oak leaves from her dress. We walked back toward the reception together, her hand resting lightly on my arm for support she'd never needed before. The band was playing something smooth and romantic while couples swayed on the dance floor, and the bridesmaids were clustered around a table covered in champagne flutes, laughing at someone's story about the bachelorette party. Everything looked exactly as it should have, exactly as Delilah had dreamed it would, but something fundamental had shifted. My mother's strange reaction to Sebastian's hands had created this invisible crack in the perfect day, and I could feel it spreading even though I didn't understand what had caused it or where it might lead. The reception continued around us like we were ghosts moving through someone else's celebration. My mother managed to smile during the toasts and even laughed at Uncle Marcus's predictably embarrassing story about Delilah's childhood obsession with collecting ceramic frogs, but I could see the effort it took. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and she kept glancing toward the head table where Sebastian sat with his arm around his new wife, occasionally raising his champagne flute in response to well wishes from the other tables. Those same hands that had frozen my mother were now casually gesturing as he told stories to his groomsmen, completely unaware that he'd somehow shattered someone's entire world just by existing. During the father-daughter dance, while Delilah spun gracefully with her dad to some classic Frank Sinatra song, I watched my mother watch Sebastian. He was standing near the edge of the dance floor, hands clasped behind his back in a relaxed pose, smiling at the tender moment between his new wife and her father. The late afternoon light streaming through the venue's massive windows hit his face just right, highlighting that perfectly confident expression that had charmed everyone in the family from the moment Delilah brought him home 6 months ago. He looked like the ideal son-in-law, the kind of man who remembers birthdays and brings expensive wine to family dinners and always knows exactly what to say to make elderly relatives feel special. But my mother wasn't seeing the charming son-in-law anymore. Whatever she'd recognized in his hands had transformed him into something else entirely, something that required her to grip her water glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. When Sebastian stepped onto the dance floor to claim his bride for their first dance as husband and wife, my mother abruptly stood up and walked toward the bathroom, moving quickly enough that her small heels clicked against the marble floor like a urgent code. I followed, weaving between tables full of relatives who were all completely absorbed in the romantic scene unfolding before them. I found her in the bathroom's small lounge area, sitting on a velvet chair and staring at her reflection in an ornate mirror that probably cost more than most people's furniture. Her usually perfect makeup was still intact, but her face had this hollow, distant quality that made her look like she'd aged 5 years in the past 2 hours. She was flexing her fingers, opening and closing them slowly, like she was trying to work feeling back into them after holding something too tightly for too long. The soft music from the reception was barely audible through the thick walls, creating this strange bubble of silence around us. 26 years, she said suddenly, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her properly. 26 years. And I convinced myself I'd imagined it. That trauma does things to memory, makes you see connections that aren't really there. She looked up at me in the mirror, and I could see tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though none had fallen yet. But I didn't imagine anything. Those hands, Naomi. I would recognize those hands anywhere. My chest tightened with a combination of confusion and growing dread. My mother had always been the stable one in our family, the practical woman who paid bills on time and remembered everyone's allergies and never lost her temper even when my teenage years tested every boundary she'd ever set. Seeing her this shaken was like watching a building collapse in slow motion, piece by piece, until you realize the foundation was never as solid as it appeared. Mom, what are you talking about? What happened 26 years ago? She stood up slowly, smoothing down her dress with hands that trembled just slightly. Your cousin just married the man who killed your father. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to take back or ignore. I felt my legs go weak, and I had to grab the back of her chair to stay upright. Everything I thought I knew about my family's history, about my father's death, about the random car accident that had made me fatherless at 8 years old, suddenly felt like a lie I'd been living my entire adult life. That's impossible, I whispered, because it had to be impossible. My father died in a hit-and-run accident when I was 8. The driver was never found, despite a police investigation that lasted months. Sebastian would have been a teenager then, probably in high school, nowhere near the intersection where my father's car was struck at 11 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday night in October. Sebastian wasn't even living here then. He grew up in Portland, remember? He didn't move here until college. My mother shook her head, and when she spoke again, her voice had this flat, matter-of-fact quality that was somehow more terrifying than tears would have been. He was visiting family. His aunt lived on Maple Street, 2 blocks from where your father was hit. I saw him, Naomi. I saw his hands gripping the steering wheel of that blue Honda as he drove away from the scene. The streetlight illuminated everything for just a few seconds, but it was enough. Those hands, that profile, the way he held his head. I gave the police a description, but they said I was traumatized, that witnesses often think they see more than they actually do. The bathroom suddenly felt too small, too warm, like the walls were closing in around us. I could hear the band transitioning into something upbeat, probably starting the dancing portion of the reception, where everyone would pretend they were 20 years younger and complain about their feet tomorrow. My cousin was out there celebrating the happiest day of her life with a man who had destroyed mine, before I was old enough to understand what destruction meant. The disconnect between those two realities made me feel like I was drowning in plain sight. We returned to the reception like actors stepping back onto a stage, forced to play our roles in a performance that had suddenly become unbearable. My mother managed to produce another one of those hollow smiles while I struggled to make sense of the impossible information she'd just shared. Sebastian was now on the dance floor with Delilah, spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy, her wedding dress creating this beautiful cloud of white silk and lace around them. He looked exactly like what he'd always appeared to be, a successful, charming man who adored his new wife and fit perfectly into our family's complicated dynamics. The cognitive dissonance between that image and what my mother had just told me made my head pound with the effort of trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. I watched his hands as he danced, those same hands my mother claimed had gripped a steering wheel 26 years ago, while fleeing the scene of my father's death. They moved with casual confidence, one resting on Delilah's waist, the other holding her hand as they swayed to music that suddenly sounded distorted and strange to my ears. The other wedding guests were taking photos and recording videos, creating permanent memories of this moment that would live forever in family albums and social media posts. But all I could see were those hands, and all I could think about was my 8-year-old self, waiting by the living room window for a father who would never come home. During the cake-cutting ceremony, while everyone gathered around the elaborate 3-tier creation covered in sugar flowers that matched the real ones in Delilah's bouquet, I found myself studying Sebastian's face with new eyes. Was there something in his expression when he looked at my mother? Some flicker of recognition or guilt that I'd missed before? But he seemed completely at ease, laughing at something Delilah whispered in his ear while they posed for the photographer who was capturing every angle of their perfect moment. If he recognized my mother as a witness to the worst thing he'd ever done, he was either a sociopath or the world's most accomplished actor. My mother barely touched her slice of cake, just moved it around on her plate, while Uncle Marcus told increasingly loud stories about his latest fishing trip. She'd positioned herself so she could see the head table without being obviously obvious about it, and I watched her watching Sebastian with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle that had haunted them for decades. Every time he moved, every gesture he made, seemed to confirm something for her. It was like she was building a case piece by piece, collecting evidence that only she could see. When Sebastian stood to give his groom's speech, thanking everyone for sharing their special day and talking about how blessed he felt to be joining our family, my mother's face went completely white. His voice carried easily across the reception hall, warm and genuine and full of the kind of gratitude that makes people think well of you. He talked about meeting Delilah and knowing immediately that she was the one, about how welcomed he'd felt by everyone since the engagement, about looking forward to building a life together here in the town that had become his home. Every word sounded sincere, every sentiment perfectly appropriate, but I could see my mother's hands shaking as she held her water glass. After the speech, while everyone applauded and raised their glasses in another toast, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I excused myself from the table and walked toward the head table, threading my way between dancing couples and clusters of relatives who were already getting sentimental about how quickly the evening was passing. Sebastian was adjusting his tie and laughing with one of his groomsmen when I approached, and when he saw me coming, his face lit up with that practiced charm that had won over everyone in the family. "Naomi, are you having a good time? Your cousin certainly knows how to throw a party." His voice was exactly as I remembered it from family dinners and holiday gatherings, friendly and engaging with just the right amount of enthusiasm. Up close, I could see the details my mother must have been studying all evening. The shape of his fingers, the way he held his shoulders. The small scar near his left temple that he'd once told us came from a childhood accident involving a bicycle and a tree branch. I forced myself to smile back, though it felt like my face might crack from the effort. It's beautiful. Everything's perfect. I paused, watching his expression carefully. You know, I was just thinking about how small the world is. You growing up in Portland, my dad working there sometimes for business trips. He used to drive up there every few months for meetings. I wonder if you two ever crossed paths. Something flickered across his face. So quickly, I almost missed it. Just a tiny tightening around his eyes. A microsecond pause before his smile returned full force. Portland's a big city, he said easily. Though you never know, right? It's funny how life works out sometimes. He glanced toward Delilah, who was deep in conversation with her bridesmaids. Then back to me. Your father sounds like he was a great man. I'm sorry I never got the chance to meet him. The casualness of that lie, delivered with such smooth sincerity, made my stomach turn. Either my mother was wrong about everything, which seemed impossible given her certainty, or I was standing 3 feet away from the man who had destroyed my childhood and was now celebrating his wedding to my beloved cousin. The wedding band started playing something slow and romantic, and couples began drifting back onto the dance floor for what would probably be the last few dances of the evening. The drive home after the reception passed in complete silence, my mother staring out the passenger window while I navigated the dark country roads that led back to town. The wedding had ended exactly as it should have, with Delilah and Sebastian driving away in a car decorated with ribbons and cans, heading toward their honeymoon in Tuscany and their new life together as husband and wife. Everyone had hugged and laughed and promised to see the photos soon, the kind of warm, satisfied conclusion that makes weddings feel like fairy tales instead of just expensive parties. But sitting in my car with my mother's revelation burning between us, the celebration already felt like something that had happened to different people in a different world. When we reached her house, a small cottage with a garden she'd spent 15 years perfecting, she didn't immediately get out of the car. Instead, she sat there with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the front porch where the motion sensor light had clicked on automatically. I know how this sounds, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I know it seems impossible, and I know everyone will think I'm having some kind of breakdown brought on by seeing Delilah get married, or maybe just getting older and mixing up memories. I turned off the engine, and suddenly the only sounds were the distant hum of highway traffic and the soft ticking of the cooling car. But you're sure it's him? It wasn't really a question, because I could see in her face that doubt wasn't an option anymore. 26 years of uncertainty had crystallized into absolute certainty the moment she saw Sebastian's hands placing that wedding ring on my cousin's finger. She nodded slowly. I'm sure, and I have proof. That statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything I thought I understood about my family's history. My mother had never mentioned having proof before, had never suggested there was anything more to my father's death than the tragic randomness of a hit-and-run driver who was never caught. After the accident, I became obsessed with finding him. I spent months driving around the neighborhood where it happened, looking for damaged cars, checking body shops, following up on every lead the police were too busy to pursue. She paused, and I could see her gathering the courage to continue with whatever she'd kept secret for more than 2 decades. I found the car 6 weeks later in a junkyard 30 miles outside town. Blue Honda Civic with front-end damage that matched exactly what the police said they were looking for. The owner told me a young man had sold it to him for cash, said he was moving away for college and needed quick money. I wrote down everything I could remember about the description, took photos of the damage, even managed to get a partial license plate number from the junkyard's records. My chest felt tight as I tried to process what she was telling me. Why didn't you take it to the police? The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was struggling to understand how she could have had evidence of my father's killer for 26 years without acting on it. I did, she said, and there was something broken in her voice that made me want to apologize for doubting her. They said the car had been too damaged by weather and other accidents in the junkyard to prove anything definitive. The partial plate didn't match any registered vehicles with that description. They told me that even if it was the right car, tracking down who sold it would be nearly impossible without more specific information. And besides, they said, I was grieving and traumatized, and sometimes people see patterns where they don't really exist. She pulled her purse into her lap and opened it, withdrawing a manila envelope that looked like it had been handled carefully for decades. But I kept everything. Every photo, every note, every detail I could remember about that night. And I kept looking for him, even after the police closed the case. I never stopped believing that someday I'd see him again and know for certain. She handed me the envelope with hands that shook just slightly. Today, when I saw Sebastian's hands holding Delilah's, I knew. It was him. Inside the envelope were dozens of photographs, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings about the accident, and what looked like a detailed timeline of everything that had happened in the weeks following my father's death. The photos of the damaged Honda were grainy, but clear enough to show significant front-end damage consistent with striking a pedestrian. My mother's handwriting filled page after page of a small notebook, documenting every conversation with police, every lead she'd followed, every dead end that had eventually forced her to accept that justice might never come. "What do we do now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Delilah was on her honeymoon, blissfully unaware that she'd just married her uncle's killer. My extended family was probably already sharing wedding photos on social media and talking about what a perfect couple the newlyweds made. Sebastian had successfully integrated himself into our lives, earned everyone's trust and affection, and was now legally connected to us in a way that would make any accusations seem like jealousy or mental instability. My mother looked at me with eyes that held 26 years of grief and anger, and a desperate need for justice that had never been satisfied. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I can't pretend I don't know anymore. I can't sit at family dinners and smile at him and act like he didn't destroy our lives. And I can't let Delilah stay married to him without knowing the truth, even if it destroys her happiness." She gathered the photos back into the envelope with careful precision. "Tomorrow we start figuring out how to prove what I know is true."